Hello, friends. Happy New Year. I'm Siobhan McDonald from Granger Street Studios. I'm so glad you joined me today. Hollywood has always been an interesting place full of stories that run the gamut from being hilarious to terrifying. This was especially true in old Hollywood. But what about the films they were making? What crazy things were these artists doing in the name of getting a movie made? We are going to explore some movie fun facts, look at some art that inspired movie makers, and more. Did you know that the Hollywood sign once said Hollywood Land? In 1923, the Hollywood sign was erected on Mount Lee, but not to promote Hollywood. That year, Los Angeles Times publisher Harry Chandler had built a luxury housing development called Hollywoodland. To publicize it, he fashioned a 43-foot tall sign that spelled out its name, illuminated with some 4,000 light bulbs. The sign had fallen into disrepair by the 1940s. The H wasn't even upright anymore. But instead of tearing it down, the Hollywood Chamber of Commerce saw an opportunity. Making a deal with the city of Los Angeles, it did away with the last four letters, patched up the Hollywood part, and gave it new life as a welcome sign of sorts for the city itself and the glamorous world of entertainment it had come to represent. Speaking of name changes, a little more than a year ago, Elder Services of Merrimack Valley became AgeSpan, reflecting their wider mission to serve individuals across their lifespan. A big thank you to everyone from AgeSpan for hosting this event. Please check out their website for all sorts of helpful links to the many different programs and services available. My husband's favorite Christmas movie is It's a Wonderful Life. Next time you watch it, you might notice that two of the beloved supporting characters, specifically the cop and the taxi driver, are respectively named Bert and Ernie. If that sounds familiar, then you're absolutely right. They are the iconic duo on Sesame Street. This is how they got their names, from those two characters. And speaking of beloved supporting characters, Rosaline and Jay are the energetic and caring owners of Right at Home Boston and Maine, an award-winning home health agency. We're so grateful to them for sponsoring this program and helping us all to stay safe, healthy, and connected. Now for some fun facts. The Hollywood star who played the most leading roles in feature films was John Wayne. Here's another fun fact. When Clark Gable was filmed without his undershirt, and it happened one night, 1934, wives all over the country stopped buying their spouses the undergarment, causing a depression in undershirts in the 1930s. I'm just going to let you sit with this picture for a moment. One of my favorite songs is Over the Rainbow. Did you know that the scene in which Judy Garland sings Over the Rainbow in The Wizard of Oz from 1939 was almost cut from the movie? Assistant producer Arthur Freed is credited with convincing MGM executive Louis B. Mayer to keep the scene. And my favorite version of that song is sung by Israel Kanau Kamakawiwo, who sadly passed away in 1997 at only 38 years of age. I do apologize for mispronouncing that name, which I'm sure I did. He was also called Brother Is or simply Is. He was a Hawaiian musician, singer, songwriter, and Hawaiian sovereignty activist. Let's honor his memory by singing along together now.
dreams that you dream of, dreams really do come true. Ooh, someday you wish upon a star, wake up where the clouds are far behind. Be where trouble melts like lemon drops, high above the chimney top. That's where you find me, oh, somewhere over the rainbow. Bluebirds fly, and the dream that you dare to, oh why can't I? Well, I see trees of green and red roses too. I watch them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Well, I see skies of blue and I see clouds of white and the brightness of day. I like the dark and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people passing by. I see friends shaking hands, singing, how do you do? They really say, I love you. I hear babies cry and I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than we'll know, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Someday I wish upon a star, wake up where the clouds are far behind. Be where trouble melts like a lemon drops, high above the chimney top. That's where you find me, oh, somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. The dream that you dare to, why, oh why can't I?
Oh, I just love that so much. His medley of that song spent 185 weeks on top of the World Digital Songs chart, making it the longest leading #1 hit on any of the Billboard song charts. Along with his ukulele playing and incorporation of other genres such as jazz and reggae, he remains influential in Hawaiian music and is seen by many as the best Hawaiian musician of all time. Rest in pieces. Now, I promised you that we would look at some art that inspired movie makers. Let's start with this gorgeous Edward Hopper painting titled House by the Railroad from 1925. Hopper produced closely observed urban views, landscapes, largely of New England, and interior scenes, all sparsely populated with figures or completely devoid of them. Although he insisted that his paintings were straightforward representations of the real world, they're often filled with an unmistakable sense of loneliness, estrangement, stillness, and mystery. Hopper was inspired to make that painting by a real home in Haverstraw, New York. The house was built in 1885 and still stands today, surrounded on one side by a railroad, just as it was in 1925. A cemetery is nearby, and the neighborhood is filled with Victorian homes from another era, unlike the forsaken scene that Hopper created with his paintbrush. Here on the right, you are looking at a movie still from Psycho, 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The real Psycho house stands on the Universal Studios Hollywood backlot, and it features prominently in the Universal Studios tour. Over the years, the house has been through a number of alterations and has even completely been moved through a different location twice. It has also made appearances in Murder, She Wrote, Big Mama's House, and the Western movie Invitation to a Gunfighter. I love this shot of Alfred Hitchcock pointing towards the house that you see on the right. And isn't it interesting, as we look at this picture on the left, we can see it really is just a facade that they built. This is an empty house inside. Hollywood is incredible. The Empire of Light is the title of a succession of paintings by Rene Magritte. They depict that paradoxical image of a nocturnal landscape beneath a sunlit sky. Magritte is playing with the idea of the simultaneous appearance of both day and night. He explored that theme in 27 paintings from the 40s through the 60s. In 1973, William Friedkin, the director of The Exorcist, said, "I chose the house to match the Magritte painting. I saw this painting in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. It's called Empire of Light by Rene Magritte. I had that in mind, and I chose the house to match it, the street lamp, the shaft of light." So here we have a still from that famous film, The Exorcist. Now, as I was researching fun facts, I came across a lot about horror films. Personally, I'm not a fan of scary movies. I get frightened enough at gas prices. But this fun, reminiscent video gave me some good ideas of how we could make a horror film today based on some of our shared experiences growing up. Let's watch this together now.
If you told the kids of this generation some of the stories about being a kid decades ago, they would either not believe it or think it was a miracle you survived. But the reality is that the experiences that we had growing up built character, work ethic, and fortitude. With the helicopter style of parenting that exists today, most of these things would be considered dangerous or irresponsible. But back in the day, they were completely normal. Walking to school was common for many students attending a neighborhood school. But years ago, kids that lived on the edges would have to walk some pretty long distances just to get to school. And for some, this was done alone. There were fewer buses and less carpooling, so kids as young as 5 would be on their own to walk to and from school. This was complicated more by rain, heat, and snow. Have you ever walked a mile in a foot of snow carrying books? Today, schools would be canceled, but not so long ago, kids everywhere were used to that trek. During the 1960s, 70s, and even 80s, kids would often have to fend for themselves, and that meant many of them were latchkey kids. They would leave for school after their parents left for work, and they would let themselves back in the house after school. It was only on special occasions you had a babysitter, and most of the time when your parents would leave, they would just tell you to lock the door and don't open it. How many people today sleep with the windows open? In small towns everywhere, windows and doors were commonly left unlocked, and windows were often opened to let in the night breezes. I'm sure there are many people who still sleep with windows open, but it has become much less prevalent ever since the 24-hour news cycle that reminds you of all the evil out there. During those sweltering summer months, playing at the local playground was much different than it is today. First off, there wasn't soft mulch or bouncy padding lining the ground. You were lucky if there was a little bit of sand at the bottom of the slide. But mostly, the hard ground was the only thing to break your fall. And who could forget the playground equipment that was made of metal and would become scalding hot in the afternoon sun? Sliding down a 120-degree slide would definitely leave a mark. Back then, it also wasn't uncommon for swing sets to not be anchored into the ground. So as you swung higher and higher, the legs of the swing set frame would rise up off the ground, and that's when you knew it was time to slow down a bit. On snowy days, kids could still be found outside. Sledding down hills was one of the best ways to have fun, and occasionally, Dad would even tie a rope to the bumper of the car and pull you around the block. The fun and also obvious danger were the other cars on the road, but mainly it was going around corners at high speeds and dodging fire hydrants and trees that were the real danger. There is no doubt that seatbelt laws have saved countless lives, but there was a time when they were not mandated by law. Back then, you were free to move around without the constraint of a seatbelt. Most cars didn't even have them, and the ones that did were just lap belts. Kids could be found laying down in the back of a station wagon, or even riding up front with mom or dad. The only thing that might have prevented you from hitting the dashboard during a hard stop was mom or dad's arm reaching over to hold you back in the seat. This was also a time before many cars had air conditioning, but what they did have were small windows you could turn outward to vent the air into the car. For many, this along with rolled down windows was the only thing that kept you cool while driving. While we're on the topic of riding in cars, every car was equipped with ashtrays everywhere. They flipped down in the back seat, and the front seat had a larger slide-out ashtray to catch all the ashes and cigarette butts from smokers as they cruised down the road. For kids in the car, secondhand smoke was just something you were used to. It was acceptable to smoke pretty much anywhere, in stores, on planes, in cars, and around the kitchen table. How many of you remember playing sports in the street? Stickball, street hockey, and even football were played in between the cars that would pass on occasion. Everyone just moved out of the way, and when the car drove off, the game would resume. The skinned knees, the bumps, and the bruises were just proof you had fun while playing your hardest. Another outdoor activity that had the potential to injure or leave a good scar was strapping on a pair of metal skates to race down the block. You would try your best to dodge all the cracks and bumps, but it was almost impossible to not hit one. All of these things listed in this video are for most great memories, despite being a bit dangerous by today's standards. They added to the fun and excitement of being a kid decades ago, but they no doubt would horrify both kids and parents today.
I think my favorite part of that video is looking at the playground equipment. I still remember the burning sensation of those metal slides that sizzled my legs in the summer sun. The Limborg Brothers' Book of Hours is an illuminated manuscript that was probably created around 1405 to 1409. The animators and Walt Disney both wanted the film Sleeping Beauty to feel markedly different from Snow White and Cinderella, the two princess films that preceded Sleeping Beauty. So they conducted extensive research into medieval paintings, manuscripts, and architecture to make Sleeping Beauty feel much more medieval than either of the previous princess films. Now, we've looked a little bit at how art has influenced movies. Let's look at some movie stars. As Shirley Temple gained fame for films like Baby Take a Bow and Wee Willie Winkie, some people grew skeptical that such a mature and talented child could even exist. They also found it suspicious that she was never seen on screen with missing baby teeth. A rumor spread across Europe that Temple was actually an adult with dwarfism. For some reason, the Vatican's newspaper saw fit to investigate the matter itself and sent Father Silvio Massante to pay her a visit. He was meant to confirm that the actor was, in fact, a child. Now, per her own autobiography, it was a surprise to her entire family when Father Massante showed up with his mission. He informed them of the gossip taken over Italy and other European countries that Temple was actually 30 years old, which the actor wrote stunned her into speechlessness. Obviously, she is not, the priest said, as Temple recalled, and that was apparently that. As for the case of the missing baby teeth, filmmakers had filled the holes with any number of items deemed camera ready, including temporary dentures. With the advent of talking pictures in 1928, there was a need for actors who not only looked well, but spoke well. Hollywood began to import many stage actors from New York, but unfortunately, many of them had decayed, missing, or crooked teeth. Dr. Charles Pincus was called in as a special consultant by the Factor brothers, yes, of Max Factor makeup fame, and the Westmore brothers, who were movie makeup artists, to develop a means of correcting faulty smiles overnight so that the speaking actor would photograph well. Charles Pincus was considered one of the best cosmetic dentists in the world. His patients included James Dean, Montgomery Clift, Alice Faye, Robert Taylor, Fanny Bryce, Mae West, Joan Crawford, Barbara Stanwyck, Walt Disney, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, and yes, even little Shirley Temple, who you see here, among many others. We have so much more we could talk about related to movies, but I have just enough time to show you one more video from our friends at Recollection Road. Raise your hand if you've ever been to a drive-in movie. I'm raising mine. Here's a little bit of the history behind that fabulous bit of entertainment.
On June 6, 1933, people parked their cars on the grounds of Park-In Theaters, the first ever drive-in movie theater located in Camden, New Jersey. The cost of a movie was just 25 cents per car and 25 cents per person, with no group paying more than $1. The first movie that premiered at the Park-In was a British comedy called Wives Beware. Park-In Theaters was the brainchild of Richard Hollingshead, a sales manager at his father's auto parts company. Inspired by his mother's struggle to comfortably sit in the wooden movie theater seats, he came up with the idea of an open-air theater where people could watch movies in the comfort of their own cars. Hollingshead began experimenting with showing movies in the driveway of his home. He experimented with different projection and sound techniques, mounting a Kodak projector on the hood of his car, pinning a screen to some trees, and placing a radio behind the screen for sound. He tried several setup variations before he found what he thought was the right configuration of projector, screen, sound, and spacing between cars. He then applied for and was granted a patent for a drive-in theater in May 1933. Shortly after, in June of 1933, he opened his first drive-in called Park-In Theaters. His slogan for his drive-in theater was, "The whole family is welcome, regardless of how noisy the children are." Hollingshead never made much of a profit with his drive-in and sold it several years later to a new owner who moved it to another location. Regardless of his failure to make a profit, the concept of the drive-in theater had caught on and expanded rapidly. The second drive-in to open was Shankweiler's, started a year later in Orfields, Pennsylvania. This drive-in is actually still open today and is the oldest operating drive-in theater in the world. By 1940, there were over 20 drive-ins that had opened across the United States. Eventually, Hollingshead's patent was ruled invalid in 1950, and therefore anyone could open a drive-in theater without having to pay royalties to Hollingshead for his patent. Drive-in theaters weren't just for cars. In 1948, the first fly-in drive-in theater was created in New Jersey. The outdoor theater had room for 25 airplanes and 500 cars. Airplanes landed in an airfield next to the New Jersey fly-in drive-in and would taxi over to a viewing spot in the back row. Drive-in theater numbers exploded and peaked in the late 1950s and early 1960s. During this time, which is considered the golden age of drive-ins, there were over 4,000 drive-in theaters across the United States. They maintained popularity as both a space for families to spend time with each other, as well as an affordable date night option. Drive-ins offered much more flexibility than indoor theaters, and that was appealing to families. For sound, portable speakers were provided to moviegoers. Attendees would simply park next to a speaker stand and clip one onto the inside of their car window. The smallest drive-ins had spots for fewer than 50 cars, while the all-weather drive-in in Long Island, New York could accommodate 2,500 cars. It featured a full-service restaurant, a playground, and a shuttle to carry patrons around the huge lot. The Golden Age only lasted a couple decades, and in the 1970s, the number of drive-ins began to decline rapidly for a number of reasons. The rising price of real estate, especially in suburban areas, combined with the growing numbers of walk-in theaters and the rise of video rentals, curbed the growth of the drive-in industry. Indoor theaters were also more flexible about scheduling and could show one film 5 or 6 times a day instead of only at night.
That was a lot of fun to watch. Thank you once again to our sponsor, Right at Home Boston and Maine, and our host, Age Span. Please reach out to us if you have any questions or we can help in any way. Wow, time goes by so quickly when I'm with you. I hope you enjoyed some of the fun facts we learned about movies and movie stars. And those videos were really fun too, weren't they? I love looking at the art and thinking about how movie makers were inspired and continue to be inspired by works of art. Until we see each other again next month, I wish you all a most joyful new year. Goodbye, friends. Goodbye, friends. Goodbye, friends. It's time to say goodbye. Goodbye, my friends. See you next month.